I'm by the River Thames today because this video is about how London is in danger of running out of water, and it gets 80% of its water from the rivers, most of it from the Thames. And behind me is Hampton Court Palace, which is where King Henry VIII used to live, amongst one of his many other palaces. So I'm going to walk along the Thames in a completely unrehearsed, spontaneous way, and we'll look at why London is in so much danger of running out of water due to climate change. And although I'm in London, as we'll see later on, most cities in Western Europe are in danger of running out of water by the time we get to 2 degrees Celsius of warming, and even more so when we get to 3 degrees Celsius of warming. This is what the British government thinks about London's risk of running out of water. The Environment Agency estimates that the UK will need 5 billion more litres of water a day by 2050 to address demand. And it has predicted that London could run out of water within 25 years. So 25 years, 2050, London could run out of water. But it could run out of water even before then. This is what the Greater London Authority Risk Register has to say about it. Following 3 consecutive and unprecedented dry winters, London is in a severe drought situation. This would mean emergency drought orders in place with millions of properties with severe water supply restrictions and low water pressure. They don't think it's likely. They give it 2 out of 5, the chances of it happening. But if it did happen, it would be devastating, and they've given it 5 out of 5 for impacts. And a drought like that for London, which I'm going to call a crisis drought, would mean having to use sea tankers to bring water into the city. They would need to reduce the pressure in the water mains so as to reduce leakage, but also to slow the rate of water as it comes out of the taps. It's likely people would have to queue in the streets. They would cut their supply off to individual houses. Low pressure in the pipes would mean water would seep into them from the groundwater, and combined with water from sea tankers would mean it was undrinkable. It would also damage heating and cooling systems, and it would make hospitals impossible to operate because they need clean water for sanitation and hygiene. They need clean water for cooling their advanced medical equipment. They need clean water for sterilisation. And without high pressure in the water main, the fire brigade wouldn't be able to use water to fight fires. So it's been suggested that London Fire Brigade needs to come up with ways of fighting fires without water, because they're concerned that these droughts we shall have in the future due to climate change, possibly, would mean they'll be no longer able to fight fires. Even once drinking water has been renewed in the water main, it can take days or weeks to flush them out to get rid of all the polluted water. Until then, Londoners would need to continue to boil or chlorinate their water to make it drinkable. London is particularly at risk of drought because the Thames Valley and London receive less rain than cities like Jerusalem or Mexico City. Britain gets its rain from the Atlantic. Most of the Atlantic rain lands on the west coast of Britain. The east coast is much more dry. Also, London's heading for a Mediterranean climate, be much warmer, be much more evaporation. So London's in a particular problem. But by the time we get to 2 degrees Celsius of warming, most cities in Western Europe have the same problem. European cities are hotspots for multiple risks of increasing temperatures and extreme heat, floods and droughts. Warming beyond 2 degrees Celsius of global warming is projected to result in widespread impacts on infrastructure and businesses. When are we going to get to 2 degrees Celsius of warming? Well, according to the United Nations, sometime between 2038 and 2055. I'm starting to lose confidence in the United Nations predictions because temperatures seem to be increasing faster, the impacts of climate change seem to be happening sooner. It's the official numbers that we use that. So by 2038, cities across Western Europe could start to suffer from severe droughts. Oh, look, and here we are. There's a nice view of the palace. And if it doesn't happen at 2 degrees Celsius of warming, then it's much more likely to happen at 3 degrees Celsius. When are we going to get to 3 degrees Celsius of warming? Possibly by 2059, to 2083. There's a boat going past now. The reason they're so concerned that 3 dry winters would lead London into a crisis drought isn't because the scientists have warned the politicians it might happen. It's because it very nearly did happen in a drought that lasted 3 years between winter 2009 and spring 2012. So 3 dry winters. Here's what happened. The drought of 2010 to 2012, it started in 2009, but it first became a drought in 2010. Had it not started to rain at exceptional levels as it did in May 2012, there was a good chance that by September we might have faced unprecedented water restrictions that would have crippled the economy, brought misery to millions of people, and caused potentially irreversible damage to the environment and London's world city status. And here's a table of Britain's 12 most serious droughts in the last 100 years. Here's the entry for, winter 2009 to May 2012. They had on average there 75% of their long-term average rainfall. So just by the rainfall being reduced by a quarter for 3 years, three winters, it nearly put London into crisis. And in Britain, we rely on the water we get in the winter time. We get much less water in the summer, and most of that is lost to evaporation, so the winters are really important. I ought to point out here, there are actually 4 different types of drought. First of all, you get a meteorological drought, which is a lack of rainfall that really only the weather people notice. If it carries on for longer, then you get an agricultural drought. The farmers notice and start to complain. It starts to affect the crops. If it goes in even longer than that, people start to notice that their natural environment is being affected, so that's called an ecological drought. And if it goes on for years, as it did in 2012 in Britain, you get a hydrological drought, and that's when the entire water system is compromised due to a lack of water. So the rivers, the canals, the reservoirs, groundwaters, that's when it becomes much more serious. And when what really this video is about, although it might take 3 dry winters for the people of London to be affected, but as you notice, you get an agricultural drought, you get a disruption to your food supply quite early on. And a drought is not a lack of rain, it's a lack of water. So obviously the rain has an effect, but also how hot temperatures are, because that leads to more evaporation and you lose the water that has fallen, and also the demand for water. So for example, in London, 1/4 of all the fresh water they put into the pipes is lost through leakage. And in a heat wave, the use of water in Britain increases between about 30 and 50% for half, so it could increase by half. Why does it go up so much? Well, when I looked into it, people say things like, people have more showers or baths, they fill up paddling pools, they water the garden. I'm not sure if that would account for so much water use, but anyway, that's the official reason. What's interesting is there's no rock-solid evidence that says droughts are definitely going to become more severe in Britain due to climate change. Currently, there are no UK climate attribution studies available that clearly link human-induced climate change with an altered risk of drought events. There has been a noticeable increase in temperatures across the UK, while rainfall has also increased recently. However, there is increasing evidence that climate change is influencing rainfall patterns in many regions around the world. This is what makes it difficult to forecast droughts, because when it comes to increasing temperatures, you can track the rise in temperatures year by year. There'll be a bit of variation, but you can see a trend. A drought is really an extreme weather event. It depends on the weather patterns, which really means, in this case, the currents in the atmosphere that bring the rain to Britain from across the Atlantic. There's a bit of randomness, whatever El Nino, La Nina is doing, and they affect weather patterns all over the world. So if it's your job to provide water for London and to make sure London doesn't run out of water, it's quite difficult to know what to do. One reason droughts might become worse in Britain is because the jet stream might change. The jet stream is this current of air high up in the atmosphere. It travels across the Atlantic, it brings the moisture from the Atlantic, drops it on Britain as rain on the west coast of Britain. The jet stream is driven by differences in temperature between the hot equator and the cold Arctic. As the Arctic's warming, and it's warming more quickly than other parts of the world due to a process called Arctic amplification, the jet stream is meandering, and also it's changing its course. And when it goes north, instead of going over Britain, we miss out on the rain. And this is why Britain gets much less rain in the summer, because in the summer the Arctic's warmer. It affects the course of the jet stream because there's not such a great difference in temperatures between the Arctic and the equator. We miss out on that rain. Significant increases in winter jet latitude are observed over the North Atlantic and Eurasia. The jet stream has moved northwards by up to 330 kilometres. These changes are consistent with decreasing temperature gradients observed between the equator and the Arctic over the period, and likely associated with the warming Arctic winters. Not only has the jet stream changed course in some circumstances, but it's also, instead of going straight across the Atlantic in a lovely straight line bringing all the water, it meanders about, it gets stuck in certain patterns. It's just less predictable. Councils all over Britain are trying to work out what they need to do to cope with the impacts of climate change. And so what's happened is the British government's meteorological office, called the Met Office, has run a computer model for the whole of Britain up to the year 2100, and unlike most climate models you see the UN reports on, they have gone down to a level of resolution where their modelling is 2.2 kilometre squares, which is 1.4 miles squares, and they've done it to a resolution of every hour. It's the same resolution that you would get in the weather reports, and you might think, well, how accurate is that? Well, when people complain about the models, they say the computer models used to model the climate are good at modelling general trends at a global level, but they're not very good regionally, and they're not very good in detail, because there's a limit to how much you can model. You know, you can't model individual mountains or forests or lakes or a detailed outline of coasts. And so models will always be not that accurate. Not this one, not the Met Office model. It does model individual mountains, the outlines of coasts, down to 1 hour detail. They're finding out all sorts of things. So, for example, flash floods, that a great downpour of rain might only last an hour in a few square miles. They're starting to see things in greater resolution. Now, I had a look. The United States and Europe have their own climate models to try and model impacts. I haven't found one that goes into such detail. If you know one, put something in the comments. The UKCP, that stands for United Kingdom Climate Projections, and it's called CP18 because it was published in 2018. UKCP Global comprises results from the Met Office Hadley Centre's Global Climate Model, as well as climate models from other international climate modelling centres, CMIP5, that stands for the Computer Model Intercomparison Project, and that was a way of getting all the computer models around the world, which all disagree with each other, starting on the same data with the same scenarios, and seeing how similar the results got to. And that was published in 2013, those results. And the British detailed climate model published its results in 2018. So really, that data 10 years, 12 years out of date, 7 years out of date. But the civil engineers who are trying to cope with climate have to have a starting place. You know, they can't keep restarting. So 2018, that was it. That's what we think the climate's going to do, at least until 2030 or 2040, when maybe they'll have another go. But that's what everyone's using. And here's something about just how detailed the model runs. Right down to 2.2 kilometre / 1.4 miles squares, and even down to hourly intervals, a level previously only used for short-term weather forecasts. Hourly 2.2 kilometre squares is especially important to understand future flash flood dangers, where downpours might only last an hour. And it's not just the level of detail that's impressive, it's the type of information that the civil engineers can get out of it. The set of projections provides 28 alternative views of the climate in the future, enabling you to look at global impacts and explore variables not available in the probabilistic projections. For example, you can investigate climate change impacts on global food supply chains. What I find interesting is, when it comes to reducing our CO2 emissions, governments never seem that keen. They always prefer to prioritise growth. When it comes to protecting us from the impacts of climate change, they take it much more seriously. So here's what the Met Office says, that we're doing our best to keep in touch with 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius of warming, which might sound a bit out of date now. I think most people accept we're too late to that, we're going to go higher than that. While we continue to spearhead international efforts to keep the global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's the official line from the government. But here's the scenarios that they're using when they're modelling the impacts so they can protect us from the impacts of climate change. Our adaptation plans should include preparation for worst climate change scenarios. UK CP global, regional and local focus on a high RCP 8.5. That's the worst possible scenario. That means an extra 8.5 watts of heating for every square metre on planet Earth. Is the highest anyone's prepared to think about. So that's the model they're using. But users can extract results at different warming levels, including 1.5, 2 and 4. And since then, I think they've run it a second time for RCP 2.6. Well, RCP 2.6 means temperatures never go above 2 degrees Celsius. Seems unlikely now. Whereas RCP 8.5, the one they used first of all, they think temperatures could go up as high as 5 degrees Celsius. That's the level of impact the civil engineers are working on around Britain, but the government doesn't announce it publicly. You cannot fault Thames Water for doing their best to understand the effects of climate change. We have made use of probabilistic projections for all RCPs, all different future scenarios of global warming, and have investigated the projections at different points in time, so effectively every 20 years until the year 2100, as well as having used the 28 spatially coherent projections available for RCP 8.5, assessment of climate change impact on deployable output. And deployable output is how they describe the amount of water they're able to provide every day for London. And it goes on and on. There are pages of it. I got a bit lost. I didn't understand it all. But what's most interesting is at the end they come up with their summary, and this is what they say. Results from RCP 8.5 projections do not suggest more severe impacts of climate change than results from projections of other emission scenarios. RCP 8.5 is the worst one, 5 degrees Celsius of warming by the year 2100. So it's difficult to believe it's not too different from the other scenarios where maybe keep warming to below 2 degrees Celsius of warming. How would deployable output results from modelling an RCP 8.5 emission scenario compared to results from other emission scenarios? They think for 2070, RCP 2.6, which sees temperatures never going above 2 degrees Celsius, would result in a loss of water for London of 140 million litres of water a day, and every day London uses 2,000 million litres of water. So that's the most hopeful one we could hope to get to, which doesn't seem likely now, but in our best case we could lose 140 million litres of water a day in London. If we have the worst case scenario instead, 5 degrees Celsius of warming, then we lose 160 million litres of water a day. Well, that's very roughly about 8% loss of reduction in water for London. And the most gentle one and the most serious scenario, they're hardly different at all. Not only that, but the range of outputs the climate models come up with in London, they're quite widely spread, so they don't have a lot of confidence in the actual results that are coming back. So what they've decided to do, because, well, they don't say so, but they must realise themselves it's not entirely credible, these results. You know, the worst scenario and the best scenario are very similar. So what they're doing instead is they're not going to look at future warming, they're going to ignore the climate data because it's not reliable. And instead, they're going to look at the pattern of previous droughts. And at the moment, if London suffers a system failure where people end up queuing in the streets for water, and there's low pressure and there's a real disaster all round, they say that's a level 4 drought. It's the worst drought they can imagine. And they think that will only happen once every 100 years. And they declare a level 4 drought when the reservoirs only have 25% of their capacity, which is roughly enough water for 30 days for London. And they're going to improve that standard. So instead of being able to cope with a drought that comes along once every 100 years, they think they're going to be ready for droughts that might only happen once every 500 years. They're so serious. To be clear, that's a 1 in a 500-year chance of a crisis drought before the climate started to change at the rate it is now. Because it's not clear what the chances of a crisis drought will be in the future, the chances of 3 dry winters, one after the other, so they're just going for a much higher standard, and they hope that will keep London safe. You might only have a drought once every 500 years. As part of the development of our Drought Plan 2022, we have undertaken an assessment of the risk of potential shortfall in water resources in severe droughts, but have not conducted assessments for future time periods or our final plan condition. It should be noted there is a significant level of uncertainty associated with this type of assessment. And what they've come up with is a chart, and you can look up how many months a drought might last for, and you can see what the reduction in rainfall would be in that time. And you can point to a square where they match up, and that tells you how likely it is that London would have crisis level drought, where you have to queue in the streets and have low water pressure in the water main, and how many days it would be like that for. So I've made some adjustments to it. On their one, they started off having a large grey area, saying, well, this is never going to happen, so we're not going to colour those squares in. I've made them like an orangey colour, which means you'd have 6 months of water disruption. But I don't really think there would be 6 months, but it's just, to highlight we could go there and it would be serious. I put a pink dot on each of the 12 worst droughts Britain's had in the last 100 years on the chart, and you can see they do match up, don't they, with the 1 in 100 year probability. But you can expect that. You can be much more accurate looking backwards than you can forwards. And there you can see I've put the drought from 2009 to 2012. And you can see, as it says, if we hadn't had rain in May, it would have been a crisis. You can see the drought that went from 2009 to 2012 was right on that borderline of having a light green square, which means there would have been disruption to the water supply. Well, that all seems fine. But remember, a drought isn't a lack of rain, it's a lack of water. In the chart here, is looking at long-term average rainfall. It doesn't take into account how much water's been taken out of the system. It doesn't take into account increased temperatures, which would lead to increased evaporation. And you might think, but that was all taken into account of by the UK CP18 climate model. It would have been the evaporation they would have taken into account, but not the demand. And in any case, they're not using the climate data anymore. It was too unreliable. So instead, they're just looking back. And when they look back, they don't look at the heat. They just look at the rainfall. So they're not really taking into account all the aspects that might lead to a drought. And one of the things, as we know, that can affect the amount of water that's available is how much water people are using. And in a heat wave, that increases greatly. I don't think that's taken into account either. And if you search through the document where this is from Thames Water Resource Management Plan 2024. If you search for the word heat, I couldn't see it at all. So you have to ask yourself, how reliable is a water plan that doesn't take into account the effects of heat? This is more than just an academic question. Remember the UN report on the impacts of heat and droughts in European cities when we get to 2 degrees Celsius of warming. European cities are hotspots for multiple risks of increasing temperatures and extreme heat, floods and droughts. Warming beyond 2 degrees Celsius of global warming is projected to result in widespread impacts on infrastructure and businesses. In heat waves, energy use increases to power air conditioning. Electricity grids can struggle as transmission cables overheat. Gas-fired power stations burn natural gas to drive gas turbines. Their exhaust are used to boil water that then drive steam turbines. That water has to be fresh tap water. That steam is then condensed using river water, so it's water dependent. In the UK, heat waves are accompanied by high pressure across most of the country, leading to low wind speeds that reduce the power from wind turbines. I've seen something recently that says when temperatures go above 25 degrees Celsius, solar panels become less efficient. Basically, heat waves put stress on both water and power infrastructure. Now, it may be Thames Water has taken this into account, and they are using UKCP 18 data, that phenomenally detailed climate model. But it's a bit concerning that their Water Resource Management Plan 2024 doesn't seem to mention this, or even the word heat. If it does, I haven't found it. And cities in other parts of the world already suffer power cuts when demand exceeds supply during heat waves. Now, the UK seems to be making good progress in dealing with the impacts of climate change, but when we get to 2 or 3 degrees Celsius of warming, power cuts are going to become more likely, and the water supply is going to become more vulnerable. Without power, you can't run your water treatment works. What is it that Thames Water are going to do to make sure there's enough water in London for the next 100 years? Here's a diagram that shows what they're planning to do. By 2075, they think they're going to provide an extra 306 million litres of water a day to account for London's growing population. And the other 3 factors they're going to use, they've all got different names, but one way or another, they're all to do with climate change. For example, the thing that's actually called climate change, 199 million litres of water a day. That sounds reasonable. Their model thought it could be 160 million litres of water a day lost to London, so they're going to try and make that up with another 199 million. But then they say drought resilience, so the fact the climate models aren't clear enough, they're going to say for drought resilience in the past, to have a 1 in 500 year chance of happening, we need to add 321 million litres of water a day. In the past, it would have been 1 in 500 year chance. Maybe in the future it will still be 1 in 100 year chance, but they're just putting a large amount of water in to cover themselves. And then they're also going to add another 417 million litres of water a day for the environment. And when it says environment, what it means is they're going to reduce the amount of water they draw out of the rivers and groundwater by 417 million litres of water a day. But I can't help thinking, if London was facing a crisis level drought, they would take that water back out again as they used to, so that gives themselves another 417 million litres of water a day. And so by 2075, they think they can provide London with 1,128 million litres of water a day extra to what they do now. So that's 2 billion litres of water now, over 3,000 million litres of water they think they can lay on in the next 50 years. Remember, they have to be extra cautious because the climate models aren't reliable enough. It's too difficult to predict the chances of having 3 dry winters in a row. And in fact, to be fair to the climate models, it's not clear to science. These are very difficult things to predict. And they think if they do that, then they'll be on this blue line and we'll be safe. And you might think, wait, it doesn't look much different to the brown line. But as we'll see in a moment, Britain isn't China. There's a limit to how much civil engineering Britain can do in 50 years. And what they're planning to do is quite impressive. At the moment, everyone in Britain, or at least all the civil engineers, are looking at the rivers and the canals and seeing if they can use them to sort of join up parts of Britain. Some parts they get the rain and some parts that are drier, you could join them up. So, for example, the rain falls in the west, the River Severn is in the west, London is in the east, it needs the rain. Well, the River Thames goes quite close to the River Severn at its very beginning, and there is a canal there that sort of goes from the River Severn towards the Thames. You could join it up with a tunnel. That would give you an extra 500 million litres of water a day. How much does it cost? Well, there is a cost document I've been going through. Every aspect they seem to say, oh, that will be another billion, so we'll just say several £billion. Then they're going to build a new reservoir, which will be by the Thames, and that will enable them to hold enough water to supply London at the moment for 75 days. In the future, that might only be enough for 50 days. That costs £2.2 billion. And then at the moment, they take a lot of water out of the Thames. They'd like to be able to take more out, which is a bit suspicious since they say we're going to take less water out of the rivers anyway. They're going to take more water out of the Thames, and they're going to replace the water with sewage. There are 4 different levels of processing you can do to sewage. If you put the sewage through all 4 levels, then at the end the water's so clean that it's drinkable. I think in Britain normally just put it through the first 2 stages. With this new Teddington extraction plan, they're going to put the water through 3 stages of processing, and then that will be enough so that they can put it into the Thames without doing any damage to the environment. And Teddington is significant because it's the last place on the Thames where the water is fresh. And below Teddington, there's a weir at Teddington, below Teddington it's tidal, so there's salt water in it. That's not so expensive. How much is that one? £301 million. And that provides 75 million litres of water a day. And those projects will probably be finished by about 2030 or 2040 if they go ahead at all. And then at least that would give you like enough time before 2075 to have another set of plans. So those are all the things they're going to do to increase the amount of water, but there's also going to be great pains taken to reduce the amount of water that Londoners use. They're spending £800 million a year fixing all the leaks. They're going to encourage people to have more smart water meters, so people are just more aware of the amount of water they're using in real time. I can see people are going to be encouraged to have showers, not baths. But there's a limit you can do with this, because in Britain they've reduced the amount of water that the toilets use to flush. It's far from a satisfactory situation anyway. By 2041, can you see this great drop in water available for use in London? So there is 2,000 million, it's a nice boat, 2,100 million litres a day used. By the year 2040, it will be down to 1,000 or just over 1,700 million litres of water a day. And that's a population that will be 20% bigger. I don't know if the people of London know this yet, but their lives are going to have to change. And they only have to reduce it that much so that they can say once every 500 years in the old world, that would have been enough to avoid any problems to water supply at all. And hopefully the extra water that's coming in will be enough to protect London from crisis level droughts. Although no one's really sure, all you can do is provide as much water as you can, and there's some other engineering projects they've got lined up as well. Also, these plans, they're excellent value for money. For example, if London suffers a crisis level drought for one day, it costs £500 million. Well, if a reservoir that can hold enough water for 75 or 50 days costs £2.2 billion. Good morning. Well done. Hello. Anyway, as I was saying before I was rudely interrupted, if it costs £2.2 million for a new reservoir that holds enough water to keep London going for 50 days or possibly even 75 days, well, 1 week of crisis level drought would be £2.5 billion. So that would pay for it. If we can just avoid that 1 week's of crisis, that reservoir will have paid for itself. And this thing, the same with the Thames barrier, is built to withstand a 1 in 10,000 year storm surge up the Thames. It might sound a bit over the top, but concrete and steel are quite cheap when it comes to protecting capital cities, and the same digging a hole in the ground to put water in, building some pipes, doing a bit more processing to water. It's much cheaper, isn't it? Much easier to protect your society from climate change by tackling the impacts. It's much more expensive, much more politically sensitive to try and persuade your constituents to reduce their carbon footprint so the whole world can have a survivable future. The reservoir did sound like good value for money, but Since I've made the video, Thames Water have announced that instead of costing £2.2 billion, it might actually cost £7.5 billion. This is going to mean an extra £5 a month on London water bills for decades to come. The other adaptation videos I've made about Portsmouth needing its seawall strengthened, or the Thames Barrier needing to be built to cope with rising sea levels, all of those can be covered by grants from central government. But London is such a big city, it's going to need so much water, the infrastructure needed is going to be so large and so expensive that it's going to increase water bills for decades to come. If you look at how future water demand is broken down, if you just want to cover what's needed for a growing population and to cover what's thought to be the direct impacts of climate change, not the random droughts that are difficult to predict, but just the usual everyday impacts of climate change, you need 500 million litres of water a day. So I can see that money being spent. But for the other 700 million, to cope with extreme droughts, so as not to have to take so much water out of the environment, so you've got it there ready if you need to use it in the future. If you didn't spend that money, nobody would notice until one of these 3 dry winters came along, or even 4 dry winters or more. In a world of politics and cost of living crisis, it will be interesting to see how much of a political problem it's going to be to get the investments made, and if people in London are going to be prepared to spend all of that extra money on water. Well done, Thames Water, you're doing everything that could be expected of you, especially in a country like Britain where civil engineering projects, they take for ages, they become very expensive. What's interesting though is all these things only work if there is water there. Do you remember the drought of 2009 to 2012? It affected most of England and Wales. A reservoir gives an extra 75 or 50 days of use. What happens if the weather patterns change so that the rains come even less often than that and over a longer period? No one's quite sure what the weather patterns will do. So you have to have water there somewhere in the system for you to be able to collect it for London. Or you can have a desalination plant, and in fact London has a desalination plant. They don't use it very often because it's very expensive. It costs Thames Water £45 to provide 1 million litres of clean drinking water using normal methods. If you use London's desalination plant instead, it costs £660 per million litres. So that tend to be 450, about 15 times, 15 times as much. I worked that out. I think it might cost something like, at the moment, people in Britain might spend £20 or £30 a month on their water supply. It could be in the future, if it all had to be done by desalination, it might cost something like £400 a month. Well, that's probably more, or about the same as what people spend on their food each month. So your water, an important resource, could become very expensive. Anyway, if water in London was in such short supply that they had to rely on desalination for all of their water, then the UK's agriculture and other parts would be so badly affected you have to question if there's much benefit in keeping London going while the rest of the UK collapsed around it. So when the civil engineers work out how London will cope with the future droughts, there seems little point in allowing for massive changes to the weather patterns, the jet stream, El Niño, La Niña, changing completely, or climate tipping points like the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, causing a complete change in the UK's weather patterns. There's no point in being the capital city of a country that can no longer feed itself. Up to the next 100 years, depending on what the weather patterns do, which no one's sure about, should be okay. Fingers crossed. Anyway, that's the end of the video. Hope you enjoyed seeing some of the Thames. There's some really nice houses along here.